Okay, we're now in the final session of what has been a long but extremely interesting day, and we are staying, as before, with the vanguard of the DUA, and it's a pleasure to welcome Gus Milne, who many of you will know, particularly for his work on the waterfront, which is indeed what he's about to talk about now.
Thank you very much.
And that's Gus on the lower right.
In the olden days. Can you all hear me if I stand back here? No. Okay, first of all, what I'm going to be talking about today is what I've been asked to talk about today is the excavations at Trig Lane from 1974 to 6, which were published by the London and Middlesex Archaeological Society. How many of you have seen this book or read it? We like the pictures, well, that's good. Thank you very much. I won't say I was upset by hearing that Trig Lane wasn't mentioned in the top 5 excavations in the Greater London area, but I do accept that Londonwick was the fundamental game changer for archaeology in London during the seminal period we're talking about tonight. But I do want to say that Trig Lane was an excavation, but it was an exemplar of what the London medieval waterfront project was all about. Like the West of the Walbrook sites, it wasn't just one site. It comes into its true life when you look at across the whole of the waterfront. And that's why this is a double-headed thing, Trig Lane and the medieval waterfront project. So I'll just say, if I can get this to work, it was a small team. The Trig Lane site was quite a large 25 by 25 metre hole in the ground, which was done as an open area excavation, in actual fact. We were originally there for 6 months, but because the building of the City of London Boys' School kept getting postponed, we kept on staying there. We were sort of like a gulag on the extreme edge of the city, where diggers who didn't have a site to go to were sent down to us. So although we had a small core team, we were much expanded at weekends with what today is called public archaeology. That is to say, the City of London Archaeological Society sent a huge number of very able volunteers down every weekend, and by God, did they shift some stuff. This was not public engagement, this was public participation. And this is what I think we should be doing today, which we lost in 1991. Anyway, we had a small core team on the site. At weekends, we expanded to a very large team from COLAS, etc. And in the summer and the Easter and winter holidays, we had a large number of students from the Institute of Archaeology. So although it was only a small team, it's apparently only a small team, we did have a huge amount of very able workers. I'll just mention a few people here. This is Chrissy, who is not only an accomplished archaeologist and excavator, but a brilliant draftsperson. And those of you who've seen her drawings in here will appreciate that. At school, she was the only girl in her class to do technical drawing, and she used those skills with great skill in the production of the site drawings for this report. The chap up here is John Burke-Easton, who, again, a brilliant archaeologist, a brilliant excavator, but who was very good with tools and equipment, and he introduced into the DUA the magical tool, the plasterer's leaf, which I don't know if any of you have seen, but is now... In the old days, excavators always had a WHS trowel in their back pocket. Today, they have not only a trowel, but also a plasterer's leaf as well, which is a much finer and better bladed instrument. And he also introduced the concept of industrial hoovers for cleaning sites fast, which is brilliant. And on top of that, he and Ian Blair write or manage or maintain the Digging London and Hobley's Heroes sites to remind us of the legacy of the people what done the digging. And the chap there, I don't know if you recognise him, that's another of our digging team, the much missed Jeff Egan, who was not only a digger, but became the international scholar for medieval artefact studies. And we'll hear a little bit more about him later. So an incredible little core team, as I say, augmented at weekends over 2.5 years. Now, Jeff Egan, as we know, is unfortunately not with us. And I just thought I'd mention just some. This is just some of the people who worked for or with the Department of Urban Archaeology who didn't make it to the 50th anniversary. And I mention this because I think it's important that we not only do we appreciate the academic legacy of the artifacts recovered, the structures recorded, the reports written, the books published, that academic legacy would not have been possible without the personal legacy of the people the camaraderie, the communication, the collaboration of all the people who worked on that site. It's very much, as Dominic was saying earlier, this was an era of enormous interaction and discussion. It was a very fertile time. And we do miss all the people. But let's not forget, it's not just about artifacts. Archaeology, especially in the 70s, was about people. Including, by the way, of course, Brian Hobley on the left. My left, anyway. Right, to get onto the meat of today's discussion, the City of London, even right up beyond St Paul's, was a working port. It had warehouses and wharfs on both sides of the river, and the river was full not of pleasure cruisers, but of barges and tugs. It was a working port. It was noisy, it was filthy, and there was no Thames walkway. You couldn't get to see it. And this continued right up to the war, when the west end of the city, the bit from upstream of London Bridge, got very badly hammered in the war. This is Trig Lane. That's Trig Stairs leading down to the waterfront. And this is the LEP building, which survived. So you can see most of Trig Lane has been burnt out or flattened, but was still more or less standing. By 1967, Trig Lane was still standing, and you could walk down Trig Lane. You can just see the Butters crane at the bottom, still functioning, and you can also see, or perhaps you can't, but the
Gustav, I'm sorry, the people at home can't hear if you don't talk into the microphone.
The people at home can't hear if I don't talk into the microphone. Okay, well, this is Trig Lane in 1967, where you can just see at the bottom of the lane the feet of the Butters crane, proving that this is still part of the working port. You can just about see at the bottom the Bankside Power Station doing its best for climate change. Also, while this is on, those of you who are familiar with Ealing comedies will realise this has a starring role in the Lavender Hill Mob. Go back and watch it, and you'll spot this lane in the 1951 movie. By 1970, all this had dramatically changed, and all the old warehouses, burnt out or otherwise, between the LEP building and Blackfriars was simply pulled down. They were still standing until that time. And instead, the large Thames walkway was put in, and you can see the cofferdam for the last segment of the Thames walkway just being hoisted into position, just the other side of Trig Stairs. So, Trig Lane in 1972, the colour slide shows, you can just see the red Butters crane next to the LEP building. You can see the site where the Trig Lane excavation is going to be. And you can also see where the Baynard's Castle excavations of 1970 are happening. So, the Trig Lane site is number 4 on the map down there. And you can see the concrete walls of the new Thames Street underpass. Just being built. And the old Thames Street you can see down the bottom, crowded with Ford Consuls. Here's a site which you see in colour, which Dominic showed in black and white, which shows very clearly the LEP building as a functioning wharf. The lower slide shows 2 barges berthed up on the barge beds next to Trig Stairs. And the Butters crane was able to reach out and discharge cargoes from 2 barges berthed side by side. So it's actually the last working wharf in the City of London above the bridge, if you ignore Dowgate Wharf, and it survived until 1986. This is important because Trig Stairs was maintained more or less because it was next to this working wharf. All the other stairs have long since disappeared, but that remained because it had a function, and we'll come back to that later. The function was, of course, to access the barges. So, in 1972, Max Hebditch at the Guildhall Museum was desperately trying to persuade the Corporation of London to do something about London's archaeology, as we've heard from Dominic's talk. And he did realise that there were sites on the waterfront which were going to be destroyed very shortly, and he highlighted Baynard's Castle, the Bridgehead, and Custom House as priority sites for the Guildhall Museum way back in 1972. In 1973, as we've heard, The Future of London's Past was published, which took an even more strident view of the waterfront and suggested that all the sites had something to offer, so don't just prioritise Custom House or Baynard's Castle, do the lot if you can, because who knows what was there. So Trig Lane was selected because it was unexceptional. It wasn't the Bridgehead, it wasn't the castle, it wasn't the Custom House. Maybe it would tell us more about the everyday story of waterfront folk. And so that's what we tried to do. And what we were looking at was the medieval waterfront encroachment, and we also looked at dendrochronology, how you record timber work, sea level change, artifact studies, and foreshore archaeology. Now, if we start with the top one, we now know that this is Thames Street. I hope you can see it at home on your Zoom screens. And we realise that from Thames Street to the river, all the land has been reclaimed in stages by some engineered encroachment over a period of at least, well, we now know 900 to 1500. If you look at that in more detail, if I can find it, we now know the phases at which that reclamation took place. Now, there's a map of the street plan of the very first London burgh in about 900 AD. It's just a small grid of occupied streets between St Paul's and the Walbrook stream. And it's there that Tony Dyson has identified the term Hythe as a place name. It doesn't appear anywhere else on the waterfront, but it does appear at Fish Hythe, Timber Hythe, Ethelred's Hythe, or Queen Hythe as we know it today, and Garlick Hythe. And it's this area, oddly enough, I don't know if you can see that, where the first reclamation, the first evidence for reclamation in front of the Roman riverside wall is found. Now, this is the era in which London was serviced by something called the beach market, where small shallow draft vessels were pulled up onto that artificial beach. There's that artificial beach. They'll be pulled up on the beach, and products would be sold directly from the ship from the boat, I should say, to the townspeople, usually not using coin, but barter. 3 pigs equals 27 chickens, or whatever it is. Now, as the waterfront extended over time, a different economic system developed. There's the first 10th century reclamation. There's the 11th century one, which you see is now extended east of the Walbrook. And there's the 13th century one, which extends all the way from the Tower to Blackfriars. Massive encroachment in a series of stages between the 10th and the 15th century. And this happens at the same time as we change from a humble beach market, which is the nautical equivalent of a car boot sale, to a merchant port, where we have merchants, warehouses, deep draft vessels, and money. So this great change in the system of exchange from beach market to merchant port is sort of mirrored by the vast amount of land being reclaimed. Whoops. Now that huge amount of land is a huge artificial intramural suburb. It's about 2 meters long, 100 meters wide, and contains warehouses, workshops, wharves, breweries, dye houses, 4 churches, and a custom house. 600 tenements, I should have mentioned, and at least 50 alleys, of which 20 or 30 were common lanes. So it's virtually a town in its own right, and that is the medieval waterfront. It's completely artificially created by encroachment by the occupiers of the land. It's an extraordinary thing. And because of the money brought in by merchants and merchandise, it was all possible. So a huge economic, cultural, and technical change. And this was all achieved by building one revetment in front of another revetment in front of another revetment to push the waterfront forward. Now, these structures were huge, still surviving to their full height, which is, of course, higher than Kathy Maloney, who needs a stepladder to record them. So just imagine if a structure like that was found on dry land. English heritage might possibly suggest it should be a grade 1 structure. But as it's found on the waterfront, it's of no consequence and gets trashed when the underground car park gets put in. But I'm still amazed by the size of this. Just look at the length of it and the height of it. This is just one of the structures from Trig Lane. Completely uncut by basements, piles, pits, or anything. Luckily, in order to understand it, we had help from various people, including the wonderful Cecil Hewitt, who was working as the Greater London Council's buildings advisor. And we had many an interesting chat about squinted lap joints and edge half bridle butteds. Extraordinary character. I wish he was still with us. So we not only have this encroachment, but the mechanics and motivation for encroachment were interesting in their own right. And we had so many timbers, we had to work out how to record timbers. And as Dominic said, we had to devise a timber recording procedure, which we did eventually relating it to the context sheets. This is a context sheet. We now have timber recording sheets instead because we couldn't handle those context sheets. But we were trying to work out how the timbers, each one of these timbers was recorded individually, what the parent log was, how they were converted from it. And then since then, of course, people like Damien Goodburn have taken this a stage further. We not only look at the parent log, we look at the parent tree, and he now looks not just at the parent tree, but at the parent woodscape. Because we have thousands of these, we can reconstruct the medieval woodland from these trees. Were they 20 years old? Were they 100 years old? Etc., etc. So I just mentioned, name-check Damien Goodburn at this point. So there was a lot. There weren't any timber recording manuals at the time, so we had to invent it. We also, as was also mentioned, tried to do some dendrochronology. There wasn't a proper state-sponsored dendrochronological unit at the time. Jennifer Hillem and Ruth Morgan did come on stream very shortly afterwards. But we had to chop all the timbers up, as you see here, and get dates from them. Here are all the structures. Late 13th century, early 14th, late 14th, early 15th. Did you hear that? Totally good. And but we didn't have any chainsaws. We had no buzzsaws. We had to use bow saws to chop them up. Think about that. And we also didn't have computer programs to analyze the data. But what we did have was Charlotte Harding. God bless her. She refused to bring her hat with her today, but I know she's out there somewhere. But God bless her. She worked with Dr. Donald Brett at the Department of Botany at University of London, and she actually measured every ring of every timber, plotted it on a graph, and came up with this picture at the end. Where are you, Charlotte? Is this true?
But it was computerised because Bedford College, of course, had a big computer. So the data would go in overnight and I'd pick the prints up and
You never told me that.
the following morning I would pick up the graphs.
And I thought you was doing all this. Oh, never mind. Anyway, she did a marvellous job, even if she did cheat and use the computer. And
It was about half the size of this room.
yeah, okay. Anyway, she did a marvellous job of producing. We had hundreds of samples, and we thought, let's try and do a proper Germanic type dating of all the site. And there you can see how it functioned. We got 1330, 1345, 1365, 1385, 1420. We got calendar dates for when the structures were built, and therefore knew how long each one lasted. We also knew if there were repairs, because the repairs would be out of sync with the rest of the dates, or if there were reused timbers in there or whatever. So we were able to do quite a lot with Charlotte's wonderful computerised dendrochronological work. Now, so we got a calendar date for each structure. So we knew when it was constructed, we could isolate repairs, and we could also, across the whole of the London waterfront, look at all the structures found and date major structural developments. These structures were not built by maritime carpenters. They were built by the the normal everyday carpenters of London housing. So anything that they do, any changes they make, are changes they'd make to houses. So we actually were able to date the major change from earthfast to fully framed buildings. I'll come back to that. But we were also able to date the reclamation dumps. Now, this is important. Again, I'll come back to this. So we were able to publish our wonderful book without a huge corpus of datable finds in it. Because we just used, instead of using the finds to date the structures, which is what Wheeler and Co. do, we use the structures to date the finds. The importance of that we'll come to later. We also used to wander down to the foreshore at regular intervals because Trig stairs were still there to function with the barges of the LEP warehouse. And we couldn't help noticing that these rubbing posts, which were there to stop barges bashing into brick walls, were decaying at the mean high water mark. The timbers above that point are kept dry every day, so they're perfectly sound. The timbers below that point swell and shrink every day as the tide goes up and down. But at that junction between air and water, the fabric, the fibre goes. So, is that interesting? Hands up. Oh, thank you. So, bearing that in mind, we realised that some of these rubbing posts were built in two halves. The top half and the bottom half. And in between the two, they had an edge-half scarf with 3 bolt holes. Can you see that? 1, 2, 3 bolt holes, an edge-half scarf. Can you see that very simple scarf joint? So, when we went back to site, what did we find? We found that the medieval structures were also bipartite. Here you see the remains of the second story. It's all been removed, but have a look at that and that. They are edge-halved scarf joints. This one's got 6 holes in it, which means that it's been replaced twice. So we not only realized that the medieval carpenters were building very intelligent structures, but they were also being sustainable in their use of this big timber. Rather than cut timbers down every 30, 40 years to build another one, they just had to replace the top story. So very clever work, very clever engineering. And also, well, here you see one of the examples. We realized that the shaded timber at the top dates to 1420, and the bottom half dates to 1360. So this is being a sustainable use of engineering in the medieval period. It also tells us where the medieval mean high water mark was in the medieval period. And here you see where it is. That's the modern highest astronomical tide, lowest astronomical tide, and that's where the mean high water mark is on the modern day one. Go back to the medieval, go back to the Roman. There's the medieval highest astronomical tide, the lowest, and there's the medieval, that's the Roman high water, and there's the medieval high astronomical tide, the medieval mean high waters, and the lowest tide. And you can see that it's higher in the medieval period than it was in the Roman. Now look where it is there, and you draw a line like that, but if you draw a line like that, you get this. High tides in London remained more or less the same until about the Industrial Revolution, and then they shot up very dramatically. So we would suggest that in 2050, certainly by 2070, you're going to have to replace the Thames Barrier or move to the Pennines. The choice is yours. So what we're trying to say here is that archaeologists are very good at telling you what happened in the past, but we're also able to predict the future. Just thought I'd mention that. We're also able, because we looked at so many structures on the waterfront, the change from earth-fast single-storey buildings to fully framed multi-storey buildings. This is a very poor example of an earth-fast building. The timbers are stuck in the ground and they're held earth-fast. Single-storey, but the change to fully framed multi-storey buildings enables you to build these. There is an earth-fast structure. Can you see it there? The main posts are stuck in the ground. The foreshore accumulates up against it, and there is a framed, fully framed jetty structure. That dates to about 1198, and that dates to about 1217. So somewhere between 1200 and 1215, London buildings changed from single-storey earth-fast buildings to multi-storey, which means you can have rented accommodation and the buildings last longer and all sorts of things. Huge cultural and social change. Then we have all the finds from these well-dated deposits. The infill deposits are full of organic stuff, metal and ceramic. And just look at the depth of these deposits. That's a metre scale. So you've got 2 metres depth of deposit over a huge area. That's just one of the deposits from the London Waterfront project. Quite a lot of stuff. And so this meant, again, a bit like west of the Walbrook, we could stop looking at finds as a method of dating sites, a sort of a cameo appearance in an archaeological report, and the finds can now take centre stage, starring roles in their own reports. And we have this landmark series of finds from medieval excavations in London, dated artifacts, be they shoes and patterns, dress accessories, textiles, horse furniture, pilgrims' badges. We can now date them all so we can look at the cultural changes within each class of artifact. For example, here we see medieval shoes. Instead of just seeing, oh, that's a medieval shoe from the 15th century, we're able to see how shoes changed. From the simple shoes, which we have in the era of the beach market, to the more refined shoes we have in the merchant port, as money, disposable income, etc., come into play. So we invent fashion, we invent money. It's a huge cultural change just by looking at the shoes. And that's only possible by having a series of dated shoes by the thousand. And then finally, not only did we look at the foreshore sites in the city itself, these are all the remains of jetties which we found on a paleo 15th century foreshore. You see the remains of jetties here, the remains of stairs, etc., found on the Trig Lane site. Well, we walked down the stairs onto the foreshore. There it is, there's Chris's drawing. We walked down the stairs onto the foreshore, and we found the remains of jetties on the modern foreshore. So we were therefore able to relate modern foreshore jetties and things back to the medieval period. And from that one study in August 1976, we did the first city foreshore study in 1976 with Jeff Egan. This became the Thames Archaeological Survey when I moved to UCL, which then became the Thames Discovery Programme when funded by the National Lottery, and then became the National Citizen Archaeological Programme, all from that one drawing that Chrissy did on the foreshore in 1976. So we have to say that the Trig Lane excavation, it was an unexceptional site, but proved to be exceptional. This is our spoil heap. There's an awful lot of spoil from that site, and there you can see all sorts of crops being grown. The Trig Lane site was very fertile, not just in botanically speaking, but also academically speaking. We had no idea at the time exactly how important it was going to be, but it did, amongst its many other fruits, was it produced an international conference in 1979, the Waterfront Conference. This was sent to Bergen in 1983, to Bristol in 1988, in York in 1992, and in Denmark in 1998. So the legacy of those sites have international consequences, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure Dominic will be pleased to know it was all done with site notebooks. Here it is, ladies and gentlemen, a site notebook full of scribbled things and Charlotte Harding's list of dendro samples. So with that thought in mind, I'll leave you with, sorry. Thank you very much.